Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can listen to us wherever fine podcasts are pervade, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Podbean, etc. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms and you want to see what I look like, what my guests look like, check us out on our YouTube channel. And by the way, please leave a review, leave us a thumbs up, subscribe, let your friends know, let your family members know, let your friends, family members, and your family members' friends all know about what we're doing here at the Federal Newswire and our podcasts. Listen, joining me today, very excited to have this guest on. He's someone I've known for a number of years now. I've been fortunate to work with him. With a career spanning over 3 decades, Rob Gordon has worked in influential capacities across various prestigious organizations, contributing to policymaking, research, and strategic planning in the area of environment and natural resources policy. Throughout his career, Rob has been at the forefront of shaping environmental and natural resource policies, research, and strategies. He served as the senior advisor to the director of the U.S. Geological Survey from June of 2019 to January of 2020. Before that, he held a significant role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Environmental Management at the U.S. Department of the Interior. He was both a senior research fellow and senior advisor for strategic outreach at the Heritage Foundation. And while he was on Capitol Hill, he was the staff director for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations on the House Committee on Natural Resources, where he also served as a professional staffer. Rob, so glad you could join us today. And let me ask you this, how has our outlook changed in the years that you've been doing environmental and natural resources policy? How has our outlook changed in the last 3-4 decades?
If you mean with regard to natural resources,
sure.
I think that the trends overall are really quite generally positive. However, if you are looking at it from the perspective of our natural resource policies, I think it's the opposite. We really have a great conservation story in this country, and it stretches back before the era where the conservation movement began.
Sure.
And prior to that time, there was substantial degradation and loss of natural resources. Everybody lived on a farm, right?
Yeah.
Which means everybody had to kind of clear a space. So you lost that forest habitat. Everybody was competing. They viewed wildlife as competitive. They either were eating their crops or the fruit from their orchards or raiding their hen houses, or they were game species, or they were eating the species that people wanted to harvest.
Sure.
The wildlife suffered severely, and everything was made out of wood. Our homes, our fences, our wagons, our boats, our buildings, our train tracks, and the fuel in our fire. So there was a period where wildlife was wiped out, habitat was dramatically altered, and we have been recovering from that since about the 1920s. And that's why I say trends are really generally very good. And I'm talking about both habitat and wildlife.
Well, I mean, let's talk about this because, around that time, the late 19th century into the early 20th century, we had a greater understanding of this concept called the tragedy of the commons. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that and why that's important in terms of environmental, in terms of natural resources policy.
Well, it comes into play greatly with wildlife. Basically, the theory behind the tragedy of the commons is if nobody owned a natural resource, then people would all compete as quickly as possible to exploit it.
Right.
And, kind of the classic examples are buffalo.
Yeah.
They were out there running around on federal lands or on tribal lands, or vast tracts that were somehow came into private hands. And people were just eager to go out and shoot their own buffalo. And there were campaigns to actually reduce the number of buffalo. And as a result, a buffalo herd that clearly numbered in the tens of millions dwindled to well below 1 million. Nobody owned it. Nobody had a vested interest to take care of that species or to make sure that it was preserved. And there weren't really laws on the books that were directed towards making sure wildlife was responsibly managed. And as a consequence, some species suffered significantly from the tragedy of the commons, like the passenger pigeon that was driven to extinction by what was called market hunting at the time.
Well, talk about that. I mean, talk about what was market hunting? How did that figure into all this?
Well, we had a culture that was essentially established originally on people going out and fending for themselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they grew their food, they caught it, or they shot it. And in the early, all the way back into the 1800s, you had people starting to engage in the commerce of wildlife. Particularly notable are, whaling, for example.
Sure.
But it also occurred with terrestrial species, game birds and game mammals. And so people would be harvesting deer and shipping them for others to consume, or doing the same with passenger pigeons. And as a result, without appropriate state regulation or people defending essentially an interest that they had in that species, they dwindled. Some of them went extinct, but most of them have come back from really depleted numbers.
And when we talk about this difference between, things that are privately held and privately managed versus things that are out in the commons, this is the difference between the passenger pigeon and the chicken or the turkey or the beef cattle and buffalo. I mean, it's a situation where there's an ownership stake that is at work here. I may come back to how we can apply these sort of property rights models to species preservation. But one of the things that it does teach us is that we need to learn over time. We discover things and we learn over time how best to sort of how to approach a societal problem, whether it's through a regulatory process or through a market-based process, some kind of an incentivization structure. In fact, let's talk about this within the context of the Endangered Species Act. We're about to hit our 50th. If we haven't hit our 50th anniversary, have we hit our 50th anniversary of the ESA, Rob?
No, it'll be on December 28th.
Wow. So just getting in there under the wire there. 50 years of the ESA. Let's talk about that piece of legislation, what it does, whether it's been successful, and what have we learned and not changed yet in terms of the ESA?
Well, I think we've learned a lot. I don't think we have applied that. I think there's been kind of denial as to regards to how well the law functions. As I started out saying, wildlife populations were severely depleted. And policy is often, trying to catch up with things that have already happened. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, and people were still working under kind of the mindset of the tremendous loss of natural resources, particularly wildlife, and the substantial changes in land use that had occurred over the last couple hundred years.
Yeah.
And the trends had already started to change. And there were already a lot of different regulations and rules on the books. And there was a conservation movement that had been established. And so by the time the ESA became law, I would argue a lot of the trends had already changed.
Sure.
That hasn't still affected the way people think about extinction or the application of the law. The law has been on the books now for 50 years. There's 1,628 I think, different entities listed, animals and plants.
Oh.
And after that 50 years, you would hope we would have seen a lot more success than we have seen.
Right.
There's only 86 domestic species that have ever come off, 11 by virtue of extinction, 21 by virtue of date that there is a recognition by the federal agencies that the data used to list it were in error. That leaves you with about 54 that supposedly were removed from the list because the law worked. It recovered them. That's at least what the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, or NOAA Fisheries, the agencies that implement the ESA, stated when they took those plants or animals off the endangered species list. However, when you really explore those 54 species, you find out the record is even worse. That about half or so actually were put on in error.
Wow.
And then claimed to be a success, but they really weren't.
Well, let's talk about the law itself, because I think, obviously we'll probably drill down a little bit, no pun intended, into the issue of incidental take permits, which is a huge issue in terms of how you want to make use of your land. But a lot of folks don't realize that while the ESA protects species from being killed, what it really is, it's about land use management, isn't it? It's not really about the species themselves, but it's about making prohibitions on how folks use land. Talk about this.
I'd say in general, that's true.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's not to say there are no species that have benefited, or there haven't been specific actions that have been beneficial to a truly endangered species. The Fish and Wildlife Service has done kind of remarkable work on the California condor,
Sure.
bringing it back from very few through captive breeding to hundreds today. I think that may be kind of the exception. We don't have really very good measurements of the law, but it seems to be more used as a means of controlling land use.
Sure.
And that's basically done through a couple of provisions. If I could step back,
Please.
To describe the law in a nutshell, what the agencies are supposed to do is identify a plant or animal that's endangered or threatened, which is a lower level of protection, put them on a list, fix them up, and then take them off. We've already addressed that they haven't taken many off.
Right.
And most of those that they've taken off have really been because they were mistakes. While the species are on the list, that's where the conflict comes in with land use. And there are a couple of different mechanisms under the law that land use is affected by. One is something called designation of critical habitat. And there's at least an area the size of California, maybe double the size of California, that's been designated as critical habitat for endangered species.
And I'm sorry, Rob, let me just ask, these are private lands that are been designated as critical habitat, public lands, or both?
It's a mix.
Okay, got it.
And there are other areas I'm leaving out. They also designate critical habitat along rivers. And they do that based not on acreage, but river miles.
Yeah.
In any case, I would argue that the lion's share of the regulatory impact is not through the critical habitat, although specific, the analysis of the economic impact for specific species with regard to their critical habitat impact can be in the billions of dollars.
Wow.
However, the lion's share is through a provision of the Endangered Species Act called take. And you are prohibited from taking an endangered species. Taking means to shoot, wound, kill, hunt, trap, capture, collect, harm, harass, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. It's a kind of a do verb, right?
Right.
I'm going to go out and I trap this animal, or I shoot this animal, or I wound it. But several years ago, in a Supreme Court ruling, the element of take, harm, was expansively interpreted to include habitat modification. So now if you have a golden cheek warbler on your property
I was going to ask you about the golden cheek warbler.
It needs cedar trees.
Yes.
Then you don't necessarily have to trap the golden cheek warbler or shoot it or capture it or wound it. If you cut down the type of tree that it needs for nesting, the agency could determine you have now taken the species.
Sure.
And take comes with both civil and potentially criminal penalties and fines.
Yeah.
And there was a biologist at the Fish and Wildlife Service who said many years ago, one of the problems with the Endangered Species Act is if I find a rare metal on my land, like gold, the value of my land goes up.
Right.
But if I find a rare salamander or snail or beetle or butterfly, the value goes down.
And I'm sorry, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you are in an area where the golden cheek warbler might be, and you happen to find that you have cedar trees on your property, that's a problem.
Well, there's an old saying, shoot, shovel, and shut up.
This is where I was going to go. Talk about the shoot, shovel, and shut up syndrome and the disincentives within the ESA.
Yeah, I think that statement that the price of the value of the land goes down with the endangered species kind of reveals one of the inherent flaws of the law. And that is, if you want more of something, you don't punish people for having it.
Right.
And that's kind of the effect of the Endangered Species Act right now, because you lose control and management over your property, possibly. And it doesn't actually have to happen. There just has to be the threat of it to affect people's behavior.
Right.
And if we want more of something, that's not what we should be encouraging. But obviously, there are not going to be very good statistics on that because it's potentially illegal behavior. And people are not going to be out saying, yeah, I got rid of that thing because I was concerned my cow pasture would be lost. Right now, one of the things I know people in the cattle industry are concerned about is the monarch butterfly.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody loves the monarch butterfly. The monarch has a particular host plant that it lives on, and that's milkweed.
Milkweed, yeah.
Problem for cattlemen is that milkweed is poisonous to cattle, but the cattle will eat it. So they're going to want to control it in their fields, right? To eliminate the potential that their cattle die off. That's basically their bank account. All of their money is in that cattle. And if they're unable to control milkweed on their pasture, it could present a serious problem. But they may face the dilemma that the Fish and Wildlife Service could interpret that to constitute taking an endangered butterfly. Right.
Well, and let's talk about this. So let's say one of the other great problems here is that if you are a rancher and you do discover that there's milkweed on your property and you want to do something to get rid of the milkweed, you have to then go and file with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service one of these incidental take permits. So you have to, at least as clear as I understand it, you have to admit that what you're doing, even if you don't think it's actually going to harm a species, even if your intention is not to harm a monarch butterfly, you have to admit in your application that this could potentially harm them, which puts you at a severe disadvantage in terms of making one of these applications, doesn't it?
Yes. The ESA is a strict liability law. You don't have to know that by going out and collecting a monarch butterfly or picking up a particular endangered turtle, or that you are violating the Endangered Species Act. You just have to know that I intended to pick up that turtle. I intended to catch that butterfly. And that's all the intent that's taken. to be prosecuted criminally.
Crazy.
So the incentives are all wrong. Now, I would believe that some of the intent of drafting those provisions like that was originally designed to stop people who were, for example, poaching.
Right.
The people that knew there was, hey, this particular species is endangered, and it's going to prohibit you from developing that tract of land, but they went out and got away with it anyway, right? So yes, there are mechanisms like incidental take permits. There are habitat conservation plans. There's assurances with agreements, safe harbor. There's all kinds of bureaucratic, reportedly kind of workarounds to allow people to go about doing their business. But I don't think that they in general work, and you're in essence, you're losing a portion of the value of your property.
100%. Yeah.
The argument is, hey, we didn't take title to your property. But what you did is you may have taken the most important potential uses.
Sure.
For example, if let's say just a hypothetical ranch that has a couple hundred acres, but it only has 2 water holes, and they're very small, but those water holes are home to a particular endangered species. Well, if the Fish and Wildlife Service comes in and restricts your use of those 2 water holes, they haven't affected the other 195 acres.
Right.
But they've affected the 5 that are essentially, critical to the functioning of the ranch. You can't have the cattle without the water.
Sure.
And basically the result is, that ranch owner becomes responsible for delivering a public good.
Right.
If we all want to preserve endangered species, then we should all bear the cost, not individuals. And they are essentially bearing the cost by losing value in their property.
Well, losing value and losing uses. I mean, that's the two go hand in hand. This is what Rob's talking about, folks, is the concept of the regulatory taking, the idea that regulations can serve to take private property in no less of a manner than if the government had come out and said, we're going to condemn it and turn it into a public park. I mean, that's essentially what they're talking about here. In fact, Rob, let's pull it back to the 30,000 foot level again for a moment, because I think it's important for folks to understand this. And by the way, a lot of this is in a really great report Rob did for the Heritage Foundation last year called Lands and Habitat in the United States, a reality check. I urge you all to go and check that out. Because I want to come back to the issue of not changing laws over the course of 5 decades and learning things. But right now, what I want to focus on is this issue of land control and use restrictions, right? We know that west of the Mississippi, the federal government owns and controls vast majorities of those lands. Much of that is Bureau of Land Management land, but it's also U.S. Forest Service land. We've spent a lot of time in this show talking about these things. For many, many years, folks east of the Rockies, and certainly east of the Mississippi, have been largely immune from the problems of this. But then you have the passage of the Clean Water Act and how that impacts wetlands, and the Endangered Species Act and how that impacts other land uses. And I guess my question here, or what I want to get your comment on, is the issue of how much is enough for the environmental left? And essentially, is the goal to essentially make it so that no land gets utilized ever, right? If it's publicly owned, they don't want cattle on it. They don't want resources extracted from it. They certainly don't want oil extracted from it. They don't want any kind of motorized recreation on it. They just want one particular kind of land use, and that is for recreation, regardless of what kind of land that is or where it is. Essentially, the left wants all of this land locked up and never used. I mean, am I wrong here? Am I overstating the goal?
Generally not.
Not to back you into a corner, Rob, but
it's difficult to ascribe a uniform set of motives to a large group of people. I think all Americans want wildlife and habitat to be conserved, be plentiful, be there for future generations. I think that, traditionally we have a very strong conservation movement that
Sure.
really initiated some of the most successful wildlife management and restoration programs. A lot of the backbone of that movement came out of the hunting and fishing community, actually.
Sure.
And huge amounts of the habitat were provided by people who are in farming, ranching, or privately owned forests. A lot of people who are in those areas of work choose that because they love it, right?
Right.
And kind of the problem is with the modern environmental movement, where owning a really unique resource on your property used to kind of be a source of a bragging right.
Right.
We've made it a liability. And in general, I think there are people in the environmental community who are just seriously misinformed, kind of cognitive dissonance, just accept kind of hook, line, and sinker a story that was developed decades ago and see human beings as a net negative. I mean, we are just bad and destructive.
Let's talk about one of those false stories, which is this idea that we're getting, biome collapses, the idea that we're having these mass extinction events. Talk about this. I mean, we should have talked about it earlier on as we're talking about how things have improved over time, but talk about this myth about biome collapses.
Okay. But first, let me add on the other,
please,
because I don't think I answered your question fully. But there are other people who are using environmental regulations basically to constrict human activity into economic growth. And there's no question about that. And that's because they see human beings as a net negative.
Right.
For a lot of people, I think they do so based on this scare that we are seeing this massive extinction rate, that biomes are collapsing, that we're losing habitat, that it's disappearing at this incredible rate, and that as we have more and more people and more economic growth, inevitably it's going to increase. This is an entirely flawed view of the world.
Right.
The reality is, if you take wildlife populations that we have the best data for, and you go back a century, you look at bison, muskoxen, moose, elk, antelope, mule deer, white-tailed deer, javelina, mountain lion, black bear, and I can go on and on and on. These things have actually increased in number. And these are all things that tend to require a great deal of habitat. If there's enough habitat for these things to expand in number, that means there's habitat for other things.
Sure.
We also find, I mentioned a few predators in there. The black bear is really an omnivore, but black bears, mountain lions, bobcats, red foxes, martens, fishers, most of these things have been improving. And if they're improving, that means they have prey, right? So they're increasing in number. But people hear these little factoids like the Sonoran antelope is endangered. And yes, maybe the Sonoran antelope is endangered. That's a subset of the species of American antelope.
Sure.
Which at the species level has come from a few, maybe 10, 20,000 100 years ago to over 500,000 today.
Wow.
They're doing great, right? And they're in 17 states. But if we look at this subspecies in the southwest corner of Arizona that maybe gets over into the border of California, it's not doing as good.
Right.
But to the average person, they just hear this antelope's endangered.
Right.
And they don't have time to go through and understand where it fits in the context of things. We have 5 different kinds of tiger beetle that are on the endangered species list. But there's maybe 2,300 kinds of tiger beetle in the world. There are maybe 10,000 kinds of beetle in the United States. What is the significance of 20 kinds being on the list? People will argue, well, that's just the 20 that we found. There's lots and lots more. But that's kind of speculative when you look at the data for some of the largest animals that we have the best data for, mammals, birds of prey, big things like alligators, that are all doing, remarkably well as groups.
It's interesting because this gets us into the issue of habitat encroachment and the myths that accrue there. There's a story. It's funny. When I was growing up, my grandparents lived in Carmel, California, and they lived next to this park across from the Carmel Mission. And I used to hike there regularly in this park, or walk through it, I should say, to get from my grandparents' house to downtown Carmel. And there were stories that popped up. I guess we were just taking a trip out there about mountain lions in this park and the danger of mountain lions. And you had some folks talking about this as an example of encroachment, but I'm like, houses have been there for years. I mean, for decades, this has been, a fairly dense little town. This really has more to do with habitat species improvement than it does with encroachment, doesn't it, Rob?
Absolutely. I think the best population estimate I've seen for mountain lions was in the 1970s. There were maybe 15,000. Today, I haven't found a good number. I've gone around and looked and tallied up what I can for each state that's reported a figure. And I'd be confident in saying there's, 30 to 40,000, maybe even more. That's a, doubling, tripling of the mountain lion population. And we know that mountain lions are doing well because they're ending up in places they haven't been seen in 100 years. That's because when the young lions are kicked out, they disperse.
Yeah.
And the male lions disperse great distances. There have been verified observations of mountain lions in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Arkansas, Louisiana, I think, probably a dozen states. One actually made it all the way to New York.
Crazy.
So it's just a matter of time before those mountain lions eventually establish a resident population in those states. And that's going to happen because what they need are 2 things. They need habitat and they need prey.
Yeah.
And deer have gone from, maybe white-tailed deer have gone from perhaps 300,000 around the turn of the last century to 20, 30 or more million today.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of deer. And then if you look at places like New England, in the last 100 and so years, a little longer, the amount of habitat that's regenerated in New England has been one of the most remarkable stories and missed stories. If you look at all the New England states, they're all 50%, 60, 70, 80, 90% forested, whereas, 200 years ago, they might have been 20%.
And this is important, Rob, because again, it comes with technological advances, advances in building materials, as you said, how we go about building houses, what materials we use there. Some of this has to do with plastics, right? If you get rid of plastics, you got to find other substitutes. If you're not, mining for metals here in America on public lands or private lands, you make it difficult. All of these things, there are consequences, aren't there, Rob?
Yes. And, what you kind of touched upon is, a couple fundamental things that people need to think about. And it's how when you're thinking about the environment, do you include people in that equation?
Sure.
Or not? And that's a philosophical starting point. For me, you have to include people.
Right.
And to me, the single most important measure of our environmental quality is human well-being.
Interesting.
And what is critical to know is that the single most important resource that we have is human creativity.
Absolutely.
Right? You mentioned it with regard to building materials, but it has played out over centuries with regard to the condition, number, abundance of natural resources. When we create substitutes or new technologies, a lot of people on the left view them as bad. They're going to do more damage.
Right.
But if you go back to about right around 1920, there was a German scientist Fritz Haber, who invented a means of synthesizing nitrogen.
Yes.
All of a sudden, nitrogen that had previously been mined in Chile now could be synthesized everywhere.
Wow.
Particularly easy. The method wasn't particularly difficult. It took a lot of research, but it gave birth to this tremendous change in agriculture because we could now fertilize things.
Yeah.
And we could use less land to grow more food. The productivity of the average farmer boomed.
Right.
And this was because of human creativity coming up with a way to artificially fertilize plants. And now we had, the amount that a particular farmer of people that a particular farmer could feed doubled, tripled, quadrupled. And this not only meant that there was more habitat available, but it also made possible you and I sitting here and talking today. I mean, most of us do not fend for ourselves as we have in generations past. We don't grow our own food. We don't catch our own fish. We don't raise our own livestock or hunt our own game. All of that backbone of society, our food, our fiber, our minerals, our fuel, comes from land, and water. And so if you control that land, you have a means of controlling people, right? And there are a lot of people who just generally believe that plans that emanate from Washington are going to do things better than people left to their own devices. We know from a lot of human experience that just generally is not true. And when you understand these few things, that human creativity is a key, not a problem, that natural resources are generally resilient and dynamic. That means you can use and manage them, and over time they can still be there.
Sure.
And if you're going to use and manage them, and they're going to be there over time, the best way to do that is on a site and situation specific basis.
Yeah.
What works in Maine is not going to work in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And, a one-size-fits-all tailored federal plan to manage natural resources is either going to be successful or horribly unsuccessful.
Right.
If you've got 1,000 little laboratories of democracy with regard to managing land use going on, you end up getting better results. We learn what works and what doesn't.
Well, and that gets to my last point here, which is ESA turns 50 in December, end of December. We have other environmental statutes that are roughly the same age, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act around the same time. But we don't seem to be able to change these laws fundamentally to reflect what we've learned in the last century, let alone in the last half century. Why do we have such problems doing this? Why is it so hard to reform the ESA, Rob?
There's a couple of reasons. One, just on the surface of it, most people don't deal with it on a daily basis.
Right.
The costs are imposed on a small group of people. Other people are told it's great, Don't you like eagles? Don't you like manatees? They don't hear about the Kanab amber snail or the Kretschmar cave mold beetle. It's marketed by what are called flagship species
Sure.
or charismatic megafauna.
I loved charismatic megafauna when they opened up for Toad the Wet Sprocket in 1992. But that's just me. Sorry, go ahead.
Different charismatic megafauna.
Yes.
So
it should be Marlo Lewis's new band name, Charismatic Megafauna.
Basically through massive marketing, people have accepted and don't question some principles of the left that when you accept them, they drive you into accepting the policies.
Sure.
One is that everything's disappearing, right? We know that's not the case. All wildlife are not disappearing. We have good data, and a lot of wildlife in America are doing well. All habitats disappearing. No, that's not happening. We've probably got 70% of the lower 48 is still in some natural state. That means we've used about 25% or so for crops, and we've used even smaller. We've been, there's been several hundred years, numerous generations since Columbus landed, and we've only managed to convert maybe 5 or 6% to developed. Right? It's a very small percent.
Right.
And people don't understand that. They think everything's gone. They also think, hey, there's a population explosion, and with a population explosion comes more destruction, believing people are that negative. So all those things are wrong, but they shape the debate, right? And then the manner in which the administrative state works is, with time, it accrues more and more power.
Right.
Through, Congress basically ceded its authorities in drafting specific regulations. And so the agencies craft them. Now, I'm very, very hopeful. One of the tools and one of the court decisions that allowed the agencies to do this was called Chevron deference.
Oh yeah, Chevron versus NRDC. Yep.
Basically, I could go down and I could prove, hey, this plant or animal should not be on the list. There's one example. There was a plant put on the list, and after having it on the list, they discovered there were more than 135 million of them. Right? Now, if that plant were still on the list and I had that data, I could go down and say that. I could submit the agency information asserting that. And basically through Chevron deference, they could say, well, in our professional opinion, that doesn't really matter. And what Chevron deference is that the court basically cedes the technical questions to the agencies, presuming that they have the technical expertise and that they won't abuse that.
Right.
They have. And it's not just with regard to endangered species, but expansive wetlands interpretations, basically across the board in the environmental arena and in other policy arenas as well.
Yeah, the example I'm fond of using is Congress says in the Clean Water Act, you can't pollute a navigable water of the United States.
Exactly.
They don't define navigable water of the United States, and all of a sudden a dry patch of sand in the high desert of Nevada becomes a navigable water of the United States. See, and I worked on that. Something I worked on. That's just not a popular.
Oh, no, yeah. I mean, that's
in the 90s.
Outside of ESA, that's the next, great environmental example. And, the way they've made navigable, and this has been done through, the bureaucratic process of making navigable equal U.S. waters, and U.S. waters all being regulated under the Clean Water Act.
Right.
And you have things that you couldn't drag a canoe through that are now, in a sense, navigable waters of the United States.
It's amazing.
And, if it doesn't stop, we're in grave trouble. That's the downside, when you opened about environmental policies, is that we're heading furiously in the wrong direction. The upside is through human creativity and a lot of other factors, the real trends and conditions of our natural resources in this country are great and improving.
And we need to be telling that story. Rob, before I let you go, I always talk about, ask my guests about their outside interest. What do you do when you're not working on these kinds of issues? How do you spend your free time, if you have any free time?
Well, I do this actually because these are some of my greatest interests.
Yeah.
I have traditionally spent a lot of time outdoors. And when I originally got into this business, I thought, hey, if I do this on Fridays, I'll get to be in a canoe. It didn't really work out that way. I was more likely reading some Federal Register notice. But I do love to hike, camp, canoe. I've dragged all my daughters through the woods for their entire existence, finding turtles and bugs that I have a particular affinity for. I have done a lot of gardening in my life,
Sure.
improving just our own habitat around here. And I am very interested in history. So I read and research a lot of history on these issues, as well as some others, particularly around the turn of the century.
So it's one of those things where, as demonized as the Republican staffers for the Natural Resources Committee were in the 90s and into the 2000s, folks really need to understand that these are all folks who had a deep and abiding interest in the natural world, what was happening around them, what was happening in the outdoors. The staffers that I've always known were always interested in that. Rob, how do folks find out more about the work that you're doing? I mean, obviously, as I said, you can go check out this report at the Heritage Foundation, Lands and Habitat in the United States, a reality check. You get public. How do folks find out more about the work that you're doing?
Well, most of the stuff that I produce under other institutes' auspices.
Sure.
Like the one you just mentioned for Heritage. I'm working right now on some endangered species research, and that will be produced by another organization. And hopefully people will hear about it when it comes out. They'll be promoting it. That's the Western Caucus.
I will make sure that I promote that. Well, Rob Gordon, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Hey, it was absolutely a pleasure.
So this has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. As I've said, please leave a review, leave a comment. If you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, you're watching us on YouTube, we will be back next week with another episode. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.